In 1932, the Australian military deployed soldiers armed with machine guns to fight birds. Not metaphorically, not as a joke. Real soldiers, real weapons, real ammunition against emus. And somehow, the birds won. What began as a desperate attempt to save struggling farms became one of the strangest military operations in modern history. A conflict against an enemy that could not be negotiated with, could not be intimidated, and could not be stopped by ordinary force. This is the bizarre true story of the Emu War. To understand how Australia ended up fighting giant flightless birds, you first have to understand what happened after World War I. The war had devastated Australia. More than 60,000 Australians had died fighting overseas. Thousands more returned home, wounded, traumatized, or struggling to rebuild their lives. And when those surviving soldiers came back, the government promised them a better future. Land, opportunity, a chance to start over. Thousands of veterans were encouraged to settle on farms in Western Australia. On paper, it sounded noble. Give former soldiers land, help them become farmers, let them build homes, let them feed their families, and strengthen the country's economy at the same time. But the reality was far harder. Much of the land was harsh, the soil was difficult, the climate was unforgiving, rainfall could be unpredictable, equipment was expensive, and farming in that part of Western Australia was not the easy new beginning many veterans had been promised. These men had survived the trenches of World War I. They had faced artillery, disease, mud, gas, and death. But now they were fighting a quieter battle: debt, drought, isolation, and the brutal economics of farming. Then came the Great Depression. Wheat prices collapsed, markets failed, money became scarce, families struggled to survive, and for many farmers, the dream they had been promised was already beginning to fall apart. They had land, but not security. They had work, but not profit. They had survived war overseas, only to come home and face ruin in the fields. That is what makes the story more than a joke. The absurd part is the military campaign. The human part is the pressure that led desperate farmers to ask for it. Then, the emus arrived. Every year, thousands of emus migrated across Australia. They moved in search of food and water, and in 1932, large numbers of them came into the wheat-growing regions of Western Australia. To the farmers, it looked like an invasion. These were not small birds. Emus can stand nearly 6 feet tall. They are fast, powerful, hard to corner, and almost impossible to control in large numbers. Around 20,000 emus descended on farmland in Western Australia. They entered fields, they ate crops, they trampled wheat, they smashed through fences, and they damaged land that many farmers had already fought desperately to keep alive. But the damage did not stop there. When the emus broke through fences, rabbits poured through the gaps. And rabbits were already one of Australia's most destructive agricultural pests. So the farmers were not just dealing with birds, they were dealing with birds that opened the way for even more destruction. Crops were being eaten, fences were being torn apart, income was disappearing, and the people suffering most were often former soldiers, men who had already given years of their lives to the country. To outsiders, the idea of a war against birds might sound ridiculous. A headline about soldiers fighting birds sounds absurd. It sounds like a punchline before the story even begins. But historical context matters. For the families living on those farms, this was not a strange little joke from the newspaper. It was another disaster arriving at the worst possible time. But to these farmers, there was nothing funny about it. This was their livelihood, their food, their families, their future. Every broken fence meant more work. Every damaged field meant less income. Every lost crop pushed them closer to failure, so they demanded help from the government, and surprisingly, the government agreed. Australia's Minister of Defence approved military assistance. Soldiers were sent to Western Australia. armed with Lewis machine guns. The operation was led by Major G.P.W. Meredith. At first, the mission sounded simple. The farmers had a problem. The government had soldiers. The soldiers had machine guns. The birds were large. They moved through open farmland. How hard could it really be? Very hard, as it turned out, because the military was not facing a normal enemy. The problem was not courage. The problem was not effort. The problem was that the solution had been designed for the wrong kind of target. Emus did not line up in formation. They did not charge straight ahead. They did not stay grouped together long enough to be easily targeted. They scattered. They split into smaller groups. They disappeared into rough terrain. And every time the soldiers thought they had a clear shot, the birds seemed to vanish. The army arrived expecting an easy operation. Instead, it found a landscape where speed, distance, and confusion mattered more than firepower. The soldiers could bring weapons, but they could not make the birds stand still. Instead, they walked into one of the strangest fights in military history. The soldiers soon spotted a large group of emus near Campion, Western Australia. This was their chance. Dozens of birds had gathered within range. The machine guns were prepared. The soldiers waited. Then, they opened fire. Chaos erupted, but instead of falling in large numbers, the emus scattered almost instantly. Some ran in zigzags. Others broke away from the group. Some disappeared into brush and uneven ground. The terrain made aiming difficult. The weapons were not always reliable. Even when the soldiers did hit birds, it did not always stop them immediately. That made the operation feel even more impossible. And when the smoke cleared, only a handful of birds had been killed. The rest had escaped. This became the pattern. Again and again, the soldiers tried to ambush the emus. Again and again. The emus slipped away. The birds seemed almost perfectly designed to frustrate the operation. They were fast enough to outrun danger, large enough to absorb punishment, and unpredictable enough to make military planning nearly useless. Some reports even claimed the birds seemed to act with tactics of their own. Small groups appeared almost like scouts, while the rest of the flock escaped behind them. That may have been an exaggeration, but to the soldiers and farmers watching it happen, it must have felt real. Major Meredith later described the birds with reluctant admiration. The emus, he said, could take astonishing punishment and keep running. Farmers watched in disbelief as wounded birds sprinted across the fields and vanished into the distance. The operation was supposed to prove that modern weapons could solve the problem. Instead, it revealed that the problem had been badly misunderstood. The soldiers were not fighting an army. They were chasing wildlife across difficult land, and wildlife does not play by military rules. Then, the operation reached its most ridiculous moment. The soldiers decided to mount a machine gun onto a truck. The idea was simple. If the emus could run away, the soldiers would chase them, drive alongside the flock, keep pace with the birds, and fire directly into them from the moving vehicle. In theory, it sounded effective. In reality, it was a disaster. The truck bounced violently across the rough farmland. The ground was uneven. The ride was chaotic. The gunner could barely aim. The vehicle struggled to keep up. And the emus outran the truck anyway. The chase collapsed into confusion. The soldiers were shaken around inside the vehicle. The gun was nearly impossible to control. The truck could not move smoothly across the terrain, and the birds simply kept running. At one point, the soldiers abandoned the chase entirely. The emus had disappeared into the wilderness. The hunters were exhausted. The emus were not. By now, the story was becoming impossible to ignore. News of the operation spread across Australia, and the public loved it. Newspapers mocked the military relentlessly. Headlines joked about the army losing a war against birds. Cartoons portrayed emus as victorious soldiers. The story was too strange for the public to ignore. It had everything newspapers loved: military confidence, government embarrassment, and giant birds that refused to surrender. The entire operation became a national embarrassment. For the Australian government, the situation was awkward. The military had been sent to help desperate farmers, but instead of a clean solution, the country got a strange public spectacle. Soldiers with machine guns struggling to defeat giant birds. Eventually, the military operation was suspended, but the farmers were still desperate. Their fields were still under threat. Their fences still needed repair. Their crops still mattered. So after continued pressure, the government authorized another attempt. The soldiers returned, and once again, the emus refused to cooperate. Hundreds of birds were eventually killed, but the operation failed to solve the larger problem. The emu population remained enormous, and that was the key point. A few hundred dead birds did not change the reality on the ground. The fields were still vulnerable. The farmers were still under pressure. The birds adapted. The damage continued, and the cost of using soldiers and machine guns against wildlife became harder to justify. In the end, Australia abandoned large-scale military operations against the birds. Instead, the government shifted toward bounties and better fencing. The war was effectively over, and officially or unofficially, the emus had won. Today, the Emu War sounds hilarious, and in many ways, it was. A modern army, machine guns, military planning, and an enemy made of giant, sprinting, uncooperative birds. It sounds like a comedy sketch. It sounds like something invented for the internet. But underneath the absurdity, there was something more serious. The farmers were not laughing. Many were veterans. Many were in debt. Many were trying to survive the Great Depression. Many had been promised a future that reality refused to deliver. To them, the emus were not a joke. They were a threat to their farms, their food, and their families. The military operation also revealed something timeless. Nature does not always obey human expectations. The Australian Army entered the conflict believing superior firepower would guarantee success. But the emus had speed, numbers, adaptability, and terrain on their side. The soldiers had weapons, but the birds had the landscape. The soldiers had plans, but the birds had instinct. The soldiers expected a target, but the birds became a moving problem. Scattered across miles of difficult country, it became one of history's strangest examples of overconfidence, a reminder that even modern weapons can fail when the problem is misunderstood. And that is why the Emu War lasted in public memory. Not because it was the largest conflict, not because it changed the world, but because it was strange enough to be unforgettable. Over time, the Emu War became a legend, one of the internet's favorite historical stories, a perfect mix of comedy, disaster, and disbelief. But the strangest part, this would not be the last time humanity went to war against animals, because decades later, another government would face a very different invasion. Not from giant birds, but from millions of rats. An infestation so massive that entire cities seemed to move beneath the streets at night. And the methods used to stop them would become even more horrifying than the Emu War itself. That is a story for another day.